Welcome to Drucker on the Dial, a show on management and leadership where timely issues meet timeless principles. Produced by the Drucker Institute at Claremont Graduate University. I'm your host, Phalana Tiller. Today on Drucker on the Dial, we're going to talk with two guests who've thought deeply about what makes organizations highly effective, from the very top all the way through the lower rungs. And we'll start at the top with Justin Menkes, author of the new book, Better Under Pressure, which explores the common qualities of great leaders in a world of turbulence and change. Our second guest today will be Paul Adler, a professor of management at the University of Southern California's Marshall School and the co-author of a new Harvard Business Review article titled Building a Collaborative Enterprise. First up today is Justin Menkes, a former student of Peter Drucker's, a psychologist, and a consultant with the giant search firm Spencer Stuart, and author of Better Under Pressure, How Great Leaders Bring Out the Best in Themselves and Others. The book is based on Menkes' in-depth interviews with over 60 CEOs at major companies, as well as performance evaluations of 200 chief executive candidates. The best of them, he learned, strive constantly to maximize not only their people's potential, but their own as well. Peter Drucker, for his part, would certainly have appreciated Menkes' insight. Self-development of the effective executive is central to the development of the organization, Drucker wrote. It's the way toward performance of the organization. As executives work towards becoming effective, they raise the performance level of the whole organization. They raise the sights of people, their own as well as others. Welcome to Drucker on the Dial, Justin.
Oh, glad to be here. Thank you.
I want to congratulate you on your new book, Better Under Pressure. I'm curious to know, kind of just on a very generic level, where did this book come from? What pushed you to write this particular book now?
It was something that I saw that sort of coalesced about 5 years ago, but I do succession work, so I help companies identify who should be their next chief executive. I've been doing that for about 10 years for a firm called Spencer Stuart, and actually as soon as I finished with my doctorate, just before I started working with them, I was doing succession work, just helping boards identify who should be their next CEO. And I was watching this world of ours, and obviously Drucker saw many of these things coming, but the world had changed and kept changing in very distinct ways, such that by the time I was about 5 years in, I was sitting with a board of a large energy company, and they'd just broken record for private enterprise profits ever in a year. And when we were mapping out the challenges that would face the next CEO, this seemed like anything but the most profitable company in history. It was remarkable what they were facing. I mean, just any one of the challenges on the board would absolutely disrupt or destroy their ability to make money, and every one of them was highly plausible. So it just hit me that globalization brings just more variables. I mean, that's just sort of at the heart of what global competition is about. It brings more variables, more competitors, all merging into this world of commerce. And with more variables comes more complexity, comes more volatility. So that wasn't going to go away. Globalization and all of that is not going to go away, so complexity was only going up. So, I mean, there is no business that is safe anymore. There is no calm seas anymore. And the leaders that would thrive in that, the profile of the leader that can thrive in a world of ongoing duress, was a different profile. Mm-hmm. So that's what led me to this book.
I mean, I know Drucker wrote a lot about managing for change and managing particularly in times of turbulence. You kind of came up with a recipe or a list of 3 capabilities that comprise or are common among great leaders who can manage in times of change. Do you want to just take us through those 3 a little bit?
So Drucker, I studied with him in the 90s, and what he hammered away at was the fundamental premise of leadership. I mean, he was always trying to keep us focused to help, the ordinary understand how to do the extraordinary is the fundamental responsibility of a leader. That has not changed, but the environment in which it must happen has changed, and the workforce has changed, as Drucker predicted. It is the most sophisticated workforce of all time, the 21st century worker. So I wanted to understand what are the characteristics that allowed a leader to actually bring out the best, maximize the discretionary effort of a 21st century workforce. So, from my work, I had just a huge database with unbelievable depth because boards, when they make a decision about their next CEO, demand a high level of rigor. So it's not something that anybody sort of at an academic institution might be able to do, which is in-depth cognitive ability testing, personality testing, 3 to 4 hour long behavioral pattern interviewing with each candidate, peer review ratings. And so I gathered just enormous amounts of data just through my work at the time I started the book, it was 243 people who were being considered for the CEO position. And I looked at, divided them in quartiles in their performance ratings, and the top performing quartile versus the bottom. And clearly the top had 3 characteristics that they were most praised for having that made them, was cited as being the key to them being successful. They were realistic optimism, subservience to purpose, and finding order in chaos. And they were all just attributes that made perfect sense for the world that we're in. The bottom quartile, by the way, were most sharply criticized for lacking those 3 very critical things. So Drucker always talked about how when things when you find truth, it seems almost obvious. It may not be obvious before you find it, but once you have it, it's just sort of, that was the elegance of this kind of thinking. But so realistic optimism, what is it? Optimism in a world of ongoing duress seems like a pure good that shouldn't need to be qualified, but it did need to be qualified because the bottom performing quartile were all cited as having optimism as one of their most critical flaws. But the top quartile had it as cited as a great asset. So what was the difference? And the difference was realism. With a sophisticated knowledge workforce, you can never lose them faster than if you whitewash problems. They just will stop listening to you. So leaders at the bottom were whitewashing problems. They were showing optimism, an unfounded blind optimism, whereas the top quartile showed a very realistic understanding of the threats that face the business and what needed to happen in order to address those threats, but they showed a deep confidence that together they will find a way. So that was realistic optimism. The second, subservience to purpose. In a competitive world with knowledge workers leading the way, if you actually just give them a paycheck and expect that to really make the difference, you're going to lose. Knowledge workers demand more than just money, and the winners are the ones that help them relate their job to being something that truly matters. And if you're able to do that with this sophisticated worker, you will win. Subservience to purpose is helping people understand how what they're doing, their company, their existence, their reason for getting out of bed in the morning actually makes a meaningful, positive influence on the world. If you don't do that for this workforce, then their productivity, their vigilance drops. Yeah. So subservience to purpose is the second of the great leaders' assets. And the third was finding order in chaos. Again, one of those things where you hear it and you go, well, of course, in a puzzle that never stops changing, which is a global commerce environment. It is a puzzle that you never figure out. You don't have a strategy that you can put forth for 5 to 7 years. It's actually something that's in flux on an ongoing basis. You need to rejigger the puzzle, but you also have to enjoy doing so. And so finding order in chaos was the third.
I am interested in something you mentioned earlier about the process that boards go through in terms of identifying viable candidates for their executives, and use some language that made me kind of recall a little bit about your background. And you have a background in psychology. I'm curious to know the trajectory, like your interest in how the mind works and how people make decisions and how we behave, and how that then fed into succession work and helping to identify these kinds of characteristics and these kinds of people. Tell me a little bit about your career track and your interest that sort of led you down this path.
I've always been very interested in psychology and why people do what they do. And your listeners would know that Drucker, you couldn't get his back up in an arch faster than putting forth theories that have no practical application. So he really taught me that a practitioner makes a difference, that the study and research that you do has to have a practical reason for existing. And if you're not going to actually make a difference and it be usable, then what the heck are you doing? So taking the interest in psychology and finding a sort of practical way to help people understand why what they're doing might not be working and how to change that was the biggest influence I had applying psychology to senior executives. I really wanted to to understand what made people successful in terms that helped them actually practically do something about it. And I started working with Spencer Stuart because they do work at the top, and I find that population particularly compelling. Their impact is massive on tens of thousands of people in their daily lives and in their ability to have a good quality of life. And so I was particularly interested in them, and so that was the path. I finished in 2002, started my work with Spencer Stuart then. It's always been about understanding what causes people to be able to be effective and get what they want, what causes people to recurringly get stymied despite what they, in their own mind, think is their best effort otherwise. So that was what led me here.
It's interesting as well just to think about Drucker's own commitment to the idea that management is a liberal art, and that even in the world of business and even in the practice of management, one has to have kind of an awareness of multiple disciplines that go back to other things that can be considered of the arts: psychology, history, theology, etc. And it's interesting to see that this kind of play out in your work as you describe it.
If you're going to understand human beings, you have to understand, all of the subjects that Drucker was involved in, from art and history to these, all are components in what drives human behavior. And if you want to help people really do something that makes a difference in the world, practically speaking, you have to understand their emotional lives, you have to understand what drives them, and so all of these subjects contribute.
And I was interested earlier, you spoke a little bit about the three shared characteristics of great leaders, those who can manage well under, who are better under pressure. And you talked about the idea of subservience to purpose or to the mission at hand, and how, an organization needs to be led by someone who can be subservient to the purpose. I remember there's a Drucker quote where he specifically said that great leaders are passionate about their organizations. They don't start out asking, what do I want to do? They ask what needs to be done. And it's interesting, like I have to say, there's probably a question that the leader sort of has to ask of themselves, but then probably of their organization as well, which is kind of where I think you were headed earlier. That you have to ask that of your workforce and get them on board to be subservient to the purpose and see that you are as well.
I'll never forget, I was sitting with a high potential individual. He was at a life science, still is, a life science company, and he was such a superstar that they were looking at him to be the next CEO, as possibly the next CEO. But they put him in, just to test him, in an underperforming division with real operational challenges. And he was struggling so badly. And it's the first time in his career that he'd ever struggled. He was such a massive superstar. So I went to visit him because they wanted me to understand, why their sort of next in line was falling off. And one of the things that he said to me, he said, I can't do my best work if people are always looking over my shoulder. And okay. And he said, and I asked him about the turnover on his team, and he said, well, like this head of HR I had to fire after 3 months, and my general manager I had to fire after 6 months. And I said, well, weren't those people you hired? And he said, yes, I hired them. And he said, but you know how hard it is to find good people. And everything was someone else's fault. Everything was outside of his own control. And he said, I need to hire, the reason why I fired those people is I need to hire people with strong enough personalities that they can stand up to me. That's the very logic, the very mentality that Drucker was trying to hammer out of people, which is, it's not about you and your people and their success. That's what you exist for. You exist to serve them.
I also note that in the book that there's an attention to this idea that actually these traits, these capabilities can be learned and can be improved in someone. Talk to me about some of the ways that can be done. How does one go about increasing or improving their capacity for realistic optimism and finding order in chaos and subservience to purpose? I mean, how do I, if I'm somebody who's got mediocre skills or who I'm in that bottom quartile and I recognize this, or someone like you can point this out to me, what are some of the ways then that I can work on that?
And I think that what's so important is sort of the background you're getting at. Why do I do what I do? I mean, these concepts of you have to be a servant, or it's not about you, it's about the greater good. I mean, these are great concepts, but the practical terms of how do you make that happen, or what keeps somebody from making that happen, that's really what is useful for people. Is why wouldn't? I mean, these all sound like noble and important things, but how do I make it happen? And one of the things I do in the book is give exercises and other ways, techniques that people can use, but just in a broad sense, not things that people don't have to buy a book to do. I mean, just keep in mind the barriers that keep someone from being. So we say you have to be a servant to the organization. Well, what are the barriers? Why? Of course that's good, but why wouldn't you be able to? Well, there are things like being able to tolerate your own feelings, called affect tolerance. When you're in a position of leadership in a world of ongoing duress, you have lots of feelings that if you're not able to manage those properly, it interferes with your ability to be the servant that your people need you to be. So I talk about the barriers, the practical barriers one experiences as a human being that they must overcome. And then so with affect tolerance, I offer different techniques, like putting yourself in circumstances that will bring out those pressured reactions in a safe environment where people can give you feedback about how you are coming off. Mm-hmm. And that's the best sort of short soundbite I can give about that, but I can give a longer one if that suits your timeline.
Sure, why not?
Yeah, one of the things that I had an experience where an incoming chief executive who had given feedback to came in and he was going to be the next in line to take over a very large energy company. It's the story you and I opened with, so we might as well go back to that. This person that we were talking about, that was going to be next in line for the energy company that caused me to, start this book. Well, I was giving him feedback, and he walked into the room to receive it, and he, wouldn't shake my hand and seemed quite upset. And I said, what's going on? And he wouldn't speak to me for the first 30 seconds. I said, look, we're here, Rick, to talk about your my findings, because the board wants me to help you become a CEO that's successful and do it very quickly. So you're next in line, and I just want to make sure I give you advice. And he finally opens his mouth and says, this report you've written doesn't sound like a person who's qualified to be CEO. I said, oh, yeah, well, what part? And he said, well, the part that says that I don't listen to feedback. And yeah, I mean, like right there. I mean, so you almost want to burst into laughter. I mean, yeah. I mean, like, are you kidding me, Rick? I mean, you're sitting down, and instead of saying, I'm a little surprised by these findings, I want to make sure I understand them and why people would have this misconception about me and how do I fix it. Instead, you're not speaking and you're acting all huffy, and you won't shake my hand. And I mean, this is what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. So, giving real time, frank sort of, right in this moment, holding the mirror up. That's the best way to help people change. So encouraging people to either use their spouse or someone safe to give them that sort of real-time feedback of, right here, bing, bing, bing.
Makes me think of I have a background in theater and performance and film and television and singing, and it's that discipline, that world is really rooted in that kind of assessment constantly, and openness to feedback, and it's almost a muscle one has to build, the ability to hear that criticism and be able to tolerate, like you say, your feelings, and then use that information sort of almost like the results that you need to then impact your decisions and your behaviors, again with your instrument, your body, your voice, your face, etc., which could be your organization as well, right?
Very much, yeah. And it's how you react to the feedback is in large part determining whether or not you'll ever get it again.
Right. So interesting. I've really enjoyed this conversation with you, Justin. Thank you so much for joining us here on Drucker on the Dial. I wish you the very best with Better Under Pressure, and take care. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Bye-bye. Our next guest today is Paul Adler, Professor of Management and Organization at USC, where he holds the Harold Quinton Chair of Business Policy. Along with Charles Heckscher of Rutgers University and consultant Lawrence Prusak, Adler is the co-author of a recent Harvard Business Review article, which calls for a new type of organization that excels at combining the knowledge of diverse specialists to create a collaborative community. Successful examples of such collaborative communities, Adler and his colleagues say, can be found at IBM, Citibank, NASA, and Kaiser Permanente. What these places have in common are, among other things, an ethic of contribution, a shared purpose, and an infrastructure in which collaboration is valued and rewarded. Peter Drucker didn't write much about collaboration per se, but he certainly was in step with the overall thrust of the piece when he declared in a 1992 HBR article, The New Society of Organizations, that because the modern organization consists of knowledge specialists, it has to be an organization of equals, of colleagues and associates. No knowledge ranks higher than another. Each is judged by its contribution to the common task rather than by any inherent superiority or inferiority. Therefore, the modern organization cannot be an organization of boss and subordinate. It must be organized as a team. Welcome to Drucker on the Dial, Paul.
Glad to be here.
And Paul, I'm really interested in this recent piece that you and your two co-authors have recently published in the Harvard Business Review, where you've described or identified a new type of organization, one that excels at combining the knowledge of diverse specialists, and you call this a collaborative community. How is that new and different? How is that separate from what we have come to understand as teamwork and organizational work?
Let's put it this way. In many ways, what we're describing is not itself all that new. I think it's the same kind of organization that Drucker was talking about in much of his work, especially on the knowledge workers. Mm-hmm. What we've been trying to do, our main effort has really been to try to discern what's so distinctive about this kind of organization compared to the other models or archetypes of organization that are more familiar to people. Mm-hmm. So the idea of teamwork, for example, that you mentioned, mm-hmm. is a pretty common point of reference, but it's a notion that can cover a lot of different organizational forms, and people understand many different things by it. And until you get to pinpoint something specific about the kind of teamwork that's going to work in the modern business environment, you're likely to miss the point. Mm-hmm. So I would say much of what we're talking about seems to, we're talking about organizations that people know and love, or not so love, depending on the point of view. But what we're focused on is not so much describing a new kind of organization, it's trying to give people a language with which to specify exactly what about it is new, so that when they go about trying to build it themselves, they can be more accurate in targeting their efforts, and they can just differentiate between the false gods mm-hmm. of this, that, or the other, what we would say for sort of fallacious conception of mm-hmm. the new form of organization, and something that might prove a bit more robust.
You mentioned Drucker's work on the knowledge worker, and there's a quote where he reflects on specifically this, that the knowledge worker is now usually a specialist. Mm-hmm. He goes on to say that, in fact, he can, as a rule, be effective only if he has learned to do one thing very well. Mm-hmm. By itself, however, a specialty is a fragment and sterile. Its output has to be put together with the output of other specialists before it can produce results. The task is not to breed generalists, it is to enable the specialist to make himself and his specialty effective. I feel like that's what's also really special about your piece, is that you're suggesting that the work that people do in organizations has to be viewed, you drill down to the individual and their contribution, but then where does it fit into the larger picture? How does the puzzle piece fit into the complete puzzle to actually make a complete image, if you will?
Yeah, I think that's a very helpful way to put it. I think Drucker's focus on the importance of specialization and the challenge facing organizations being how to bring these specialists together, as in a symphony orchestra, the image that he often uses. I think that's very helpful, because one of the things that you find, I think, in industry today, and not just in industry, we're talking, I think, too, of challenges facing non-profit organizations, but oftentimes I think you find a kind of a sense that this teamwork we were talking about before will be best, will happen most effectively when people are acting as generalists rather than as specialists. And there's a kind of a fantasy that if everyone just dropped their specialist knowledge and focused on their common pool of shared expertise, then we wouldn't have to deal with all of these functional silos. We wouldn't have to deal with all the difficulties of communication across these specialist knowledge worlds and so forth. And that seems to us, I think as it seemed to Drucker, as an illusion that innovation today, one of the critical challenges facing so many organizations, is the kind of innovation that organizations need to generate on an ongoing basis is typically larger in scale, more complex, more reliant on these multiple specialties, and unless you can find a way to bring them all together to function like a symphony orchestra rather than as small teams of relatively unspecialized generalists, you're not going to get the kind of innovation performance that you need. So indeed, I think the focus on specialists is one very helpful way of differentiating the kind of teamwork you need in the modern world from the kind of teamwork that I fear many managers fantasize about when they say, "Oh, let's just abolish all of these artificial differentiations between the different kinds of expertise we have in the organization and pretend as if everyone was just a specialist."
Right.
So I would say, if you look at organizations that try to create what we've been calling this collaborative community out of these more heterogeneous specialists, one thing you do find is that they invest in what sometimes in the management literature you may have heard people referring to T-shaped skill sets. So that people would have the vertical segment of the T represents the deep skills that they have in their specialized area, and the horizontal bar across the top represents some modicum of knowledge they have of the co-workers' expertise areas. That is indeed a critical component of their ability to work effectively with their counterparts, but you can't replace the vertical depth with more horizontal breadth. You're going to need both. Right. So that's a big challenge for organizations that would rather economize on the effort that's involved in developing these horizontal skills, these T-shaped, the horizontal element of the skill set, and therefore an important differentiator of this collaborative form of organization as compared to more primitive forms of organization that didn't require such specialized skills.
You go on to talk about the importance of defining and building a shared purpose. So while we need that depth and that kind of vertical depth of knowledge, there still has to be this acknowledgement and this focus on, across the organization and having defined shared purpose. How do organizations find the balance then?
For us, the shared purpose part is pretty critical. I think for the same reasons it was for Drucker, that one of the other tempting models or archetypes of organization that managers today often find themselves reaching to and then frustrated because these models don't deliver the value they're looking for, would be ones where you forego the effort to articulate it and bring people together around a shared purpose. You simply rely on high-powered financial incentives. And you say, if we could just get the incentive system right, that would unleash all of this enthusiasm. So in the healthcare arena, for example, there's an enormous amount of enthusiasm for performance-based pay, right? We're seeing more and more talk of that, too, in the education sector. And you certainly see in the corporate world many people who still seem to believe that if we just got the incentive structure right, and then we made those incentives strong enough, then that would unleash all this wonderful, innovative, and collaborative activity. And I certainly think you've got to get the incentives right, but they don't by themselves suffice in any way to create the shared sense of purpose that you need when the tasks are relatively ill-defined. When the purpose is something that has to be rediscovered anew from day to day in the real setting, that's not just defined from on high and propagated down the organizational hierarchy. It's one that people in their everyday work have to sort of rediscover. They have to redefine, rearticulate for themselves what does it mean in this particular setting. Mm-hmm. We gave the example in the article of a little performance improvement team in one of the Kaiser Permanente medical centers mm-hmm. that was working on speeding up the turnover of operating rooms. So they were inspired by what the Kaiser folks call their value compass. Mm-hmm. So their value compass is a bit like a balanced scorecard. It defines 4 key dimensions along which the organization sees need to improve. So at Kaiser, this sense of shared purpose for the team, this performance improvement team, was a fourfold business because mm-hmm. at this organization-wide, through a long process of dialogue across the organization, they had defined 4 key strategic objectives that they call their value compass around affordability, quality, clinical quality, services experienced by the patient or member of Kaiser Permanente, and employment conditions they call best place to work. And so what's interesting, it seems to me, about that case is that here you've got a team of people way down at the rank and file of this organization, part of whose job is to define the relative importance of those 4 goals in the specific improvement project that got underway. Theirs was focused primarily on affordability. They wanted to accelerate the turnover of the operating room. But obviously, part of the goal there too was to provide better service so that people wouldn't have to wait so long for their in the queue for their operation. Mm-hmm. But they clearly weren't going to get very far if they did that at the cost of clinical quality, or at the cost of the working conditions of the folks working in the medical center. So they're balancing these 4 high-level objectives, as they understand them way down in the organization. So shared purpose is not just one thing. In the real world of business, it's typically 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things that are in some tension with each other. And so to have a shared sense of purpose is actually quite a complicated dance, because you've got to get people right through the organization understanding all of those various goals that you've set yourself, those various elements of your purpose, how they interact, and what sense they're going to give those elements of shared purpose in their day-to-day work and their day-to-day improvement efforts. So that's a very different idea of purpose than an organization that relies simply on high-powered financial incentives. Right. It's also a very different sense of purpose than you would get in what we call, or what you might imagine as another false god, which would be the charismatic kind of community, mm-hmm. where everybody simply emotionally coheres around the compelling quality of some visionary leader's, person as an exemplary leader that they'd like to imitate. They don't quite understand why the leader, whether it's Steve Jobs and his obsession to do away with fans in the body of his old Mac machines, or his obsession to do away with keyboards or floppy disks. They don't quite understand why, but that's what our great leader wants, so we're going to do our very best to please him. That's a very different kind of purpose that emerges in a charismatic community mm-hmm. than this collaborative one. And firstly, because it's more complex, and secondly, because people throughout the organization are engaged in a rational discussion mm-hmm. Anew every day about what does this complex purpose really mean.
Right. And they sort of evolved to understanding their common goals and their shared values.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm not quite sure that in this we're on exactly the same wavelength as Peter Drucker. Mm-hmm. My impression, and I'm certainly no expert in Drucker's vast oeuvre, but my impression reading Drucker is that sometimes it seems like he thinks it's senior executives that can articulate a purpose that in itself is compelling enough and then can be flowed down through the organization. And yes, these knowledge workers of whom we expect so much need to buy into that purpose. It needs to be a purpose in which they can find meaning. Mm-hmm. But that's maybe a little different in our understanding of things from a model in which the purpose itself is complex, multidimensional, heterogeneous, right? Mm-hmm. complicated, and in which people all the way down in the organization are sort of reinventing its meaning every day.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you're in two terribly different camps, actually. I mean, he wrote a lot about the idea that it's the knowledge workers who really must know more about the function and the doings of the organization than the manager. Yet it's the manager who sort of needs to create an environment, support an environment that enriches and enables the workers to rally around those shared values and those common goals.
There's plenty of common ground here, and again, I may be off the mark, but it seemed to me that one of the things that senior leaders need to do in organizations, in Peter Drucker's vision of a well-managed organization, is that they need to articulate this vision, and that the role of these knowledge workers, sort of the rank and file of a knowledge-based organization, is critical in implementing that vision, in discovering ways in which to better pursue that mission, better materialize that shared purpose, but not themselves to be re-articulating it, to be redefining it, to be challenging their own manager's understanding of that purpose. It's a bit of an illusion to imagine that organizations in this day and age can have a single, simple, shared purpose.
Sure.
The shared purpose in this day and age is firstly evolves more rapidly. I think everyone would agree with that. But also, it's by its nature likely to be fairly complex, multifaceted, heterogeneous, and needs to be sort of reinterpreted every day by a lot of different people in the organization as they confront the different challenges they face and can't wait for orders from on high as to what exactly this purpose means in this situation.
You clearly acknowledge that building collaborative communities is not easy. I mean, it's like you say, it's a dynamic, challenging thing, and perhaps more managers than not would rather something a little bit more simple. What are some of the roadblocks and challenges that you've seen around building these communities? What is it that makes this so tricky, really, on a day-to-day?
Well, I'd say that the answer is probably in two broad parts. Firstly, the part we've been talking about, which is that you may have the wrong goal in mind. You know, if you think you're trying to build this new kind of organization, but you have the wrong understanding of what it is you're going after, the chances of getting there are pretty slim. If you head down the path towards an organization that thinks its salvation lies in high-powered incentives or in charismatic leaders, or in simply recreating a kind of paternalistic bond of loyalty that has been disrupted by all of these momentous changes in the business environment, those ways of understanding the goal, it seems to me, are so deeply misleading that that's going to get in the way of any effective organization change effort. But I think the other broad category of changes is a more fundamental one, and that is that I think it's in the nature of our contemporary capitalist society and the market mechanism that is at its core, that any effort to really create a collaborative community within businesses confronts a really deep challenge that any business can only go so far in meeting. The reality is that when you have to lay off a whole bunch of people because a big chunk of your business has disappeared due to no fault of your own, it's very hard to sustain the sense that we're all here around some shared purpose. That's when you try to build collaborative relations, not just within your organizations, but with your suppliers and your customers. Those suppliers and those customers, they need the services you're providing, the income you're providing, and when you have to switch suppliers and leave your existing suppliers in the lurch, pretty hard to sustain the collaborative fabric of supplier relations in that sort of setting too. Sure. So I think there's a very interesting set of challenges that managers in firms face, especially in the business sector, obviously, but also to some extent in the not-for-profit sector as well, that have to do with the what should we call it? The kind of despotic quality of the market. The market imposes itself, it's understandable that people are going to feel sometimes that these forces make a mockery of any efforts to call our organization a collaborative community.
What would you say, just in terms of a specific example, that an organization has kind of set itself up for being able to build and create this collaborative community? Like, what is just something that you'd say that helps make that happen?
There are so many ways an organization can be dysfunctional that it's hard to define a single, a common pathway from dysfunctionality to high performance. But I would say probably the single most important thing is to find a way of creating a sense of shared purpose across the organization, where senior executives, middle managers, frontline workers all recognize each other as participating, as having some shared destiny and some common destiny that engages them in working together to improve the way the organization functions. Once you can create that sense of shared destiny, the sense that we're all in this together and that we're sitting around the table listening to each other, then you can begin working things out. So to that extent, we all share, my colleagues and I, Drucker's, what's the right word for this? Disdain would be one way, or anger at the mounting inequalities of income and working conditions as we see between senior executives and your everyday worker. This is profoundly corrosive of any effort to create a sense of shared purpose. Any senior executive that pays themselves that much and then stands up in front of the troops to say that we're in this together is just making themselves a laughing stock. People may not laugh openly, but no one's going to take their word seriously. And I do think that's been immensely corrosive to the efforts of a lot of organizations when senior executives are living in a world so remote from the material conditions of existence of their workers that there's just no community possible.
Yeah. Paul, we really appreciate your time and your contribution to Drucker on the Dial. Take care. Bye-bye.
Right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
And now, Rick Wartzman, the Drucker Institute's Executive Director, with his biweekly column, The Drucker Difference.
Peter Drucker loved to equate managers with symphony conductors. He first used the analogy in the 1954 landmark, The Practice of Management, and was still making the same comparison in his last major work, Management Challenges for the 21st Century, published almost a half-century later. Running an organization effectively, Drucker wrote in the earlier book, requires that the manager in every one of his acts consider simultaneously the performance and results of the enterprise as a whole and the diverse activities needed to achieve synchronized performance. It is no different, Drucker explained, than the way a conductor must always hear the whole orchestra and the second oboe. With this image in mind, it is fitting that William Wang, the chief executive of the flat-screen television maker Vizio, has given each member of his senior team a symbolic reminder of how he'd like them to manage, a conductor's baton. The wrinkle is that Vizio must achieve synchronized performance among not only its workforce, but also the network of subcontractors and partners that help produce its products. In fact, the company, which last year brought in nearly $3 billion in revenue, has only about 300 people on its own payroll. Yes, you heard that right. That's roughly $10 million in sales per employee. But another 50,000 workers are employed by other, mostly Taiwanese companies, who manufacture Vizio's TVs, which retailers then sell at bargain prices. The company's ascent has been remarkable. In less than a decade, Vizio has turned into the biggest seller of liquid crystal display sets in North America, surpassing such well-regarded brands as Samsung, Sony, and Philips. Along the way, it has been steadily profitable. In late July, Vizio pushed its extraordinary business model, one that embodies a number of Drucker principles, in a new direction, as it began shipping its first-ever tablet computers. Wang, a serial entrepreneur who founded Vizio in 2002, views the tablet as simply a way to transmit entertainment options to customers. It's just another screen, he says, adding that smartphones, a market Vizio plans to enter later this year, are even smaller TVs that you happen to be able to talk into. Like its televisions, Vizio's tablet was designed at company headquarters in Irvine, California, with Wang fully engaged. Indeed, his favorite part of the day is the time he faithfully carves out to visit the small lab where he can put his personal stamp on the look and feel of every Vizio product. In addition to scrutinizing his competitors' TVs and computers, Wang hones his creative sensibility by studying cars, furniture, and other goods. Drucker would have admired this approach. The best executives, he wrote, actively seek information on how other people with other jobs, other backgrounds, other knowledges, other values, and other points of view see the world. The other piece of the operation that Vizio keeps strictly in-house is customer support. In this way, Wang ensures that quality remains high and that the company stays close to the pulse of the marketplace. It is no coincidence that Wang began his career after graduating in 1986 from the University of Southern California with a degree in electrical engineering as a one-man call center for a computer display maker called Tatung. I learned all about business from listening to customers complain, he says. But practically every other task at Vizio is outsourced, a great example of one of management's new paradigms, which Drucker believed were starting to emerge at the end of the 20th century. Increasingly, Drucker wrote, the economic chain brings together genuine partners, that is, institutions in which there is equality of power. What is needed, therefore, is a redefinition of the scope of management. Management has to encompass the entire process. This is precisely the challenge Vizio faces, as its symphony conductors work side by side with its subcontractors to find new efficiencies and control inventory. In other words, Vizio doesn't squeeze its suppliers. Rather, it assists them in squeezing excess costs out of their own systems. Trust and transparency are the most significant part of our supply chain, Wang says. This notion comes alive when you realize that about 20% of those sitting at desks in Vizio's offices are non-Vizio personnel. Early on, some of Vizio's suppliers took an equity stake in the privately held company, further aligning everyone's interests. The big advantage of all this is that it doesn't directly saddle Vizio with a lot of the costs, such as giant manufacturing facilities or pension benefits for an army of factory hands, that its rivals must bear. In turn, Vizio pushes prices as low as it can. The key message, says Wang, is value. This is another development that Drucker foresaw. For businesses of the future, the foundations have to be customer values and customer decisions on the distribution of their disposable income, he wrote. It is with those that management policy and management strategy increasingly will have to start. Whether Vizio's strategy will translate successfully in an ever more crowded field of tablets, where its 8-inch computer goes for as little as $329 versus $499 for Apple's iPad 2, isn't yet clear. But this much is certain. Whatever happens, Vizio has already done wonders by redrawing a variety of management concepts on a blank slate.
A version of that essay first appeared in the Drucker Difference, a bi-weekly column for Bloomberg Businessweek.com. Thank you for tuning in to Drucker on the Dial. As always, you can follow our ongoing conversation about leadership and management at our daily blog, The Drucker Exchange, at thedx.org, thedx.org.